Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, brought to you by the Sci-Fi-Christian.com. I'm Ben DeBono, here to talk to you today about a older fantasy novel, Lud-In-The-Mist by author Hope Mireless. This came out in the early part of the 20th century, and I'd never heard of it before. I found it, through Amazon sale, like I find a lot of stuff for the Kindle, and thought it looked interesting, so I picked it up. And it is a very interesting book, for many, many reasons. Maybe I'll break it down into two categories here. I want to talk about some of what's in the book itself in terms of thematic quality and what it's about and everything. But I also want to talk about it stylistically, because it's interesting for both of those reasons. Let me start with some of the stylistic stuff. Again, this book's written early part of the 20th century, which, for those of you keeping score at home, means that it is written pre-Tolkien. Now, why is that significant? Well, I mean, if you're at all familiar with the fantasy genre, you know that Tolkien obviously had changed the face of fantasy, and it shows in this book. If you compare this book to what is presented as a modern fantasy, they're very, very different. You think of a lot of what Tolkien's heirs, or people who are copying him, or trying to write like he did do, is that there's a very large emphasis on world building. So we get into all these detailed histories of different races, and we have these long maps and languages and all this stuff that comes into making the world. And then some people go even farther than Tolkien with these elaborate magic systems and everything, and so we have to understand how everything works, and highly, highly, highly detailed. And this is very different. This comes from a very different mold. There are no maps at the start of this book, or anywhere else for that matter. There is no elaborate world building. There isn't a great magic system or anything. Things are a lot more whimsical, if you will. I feel like modern fantasy, for good or bad, is largely focused on creating an entirely different world that is as believable as it can possibly be. Sometimes it's done very well, sometimes it's very obnoxious, sometimes it's done poorly, but whatever. Every case is different, but that's largely what modern fantasy is focused on. And this sort of book reads more like a fairy tale, in the sense that it invites us into a world that is very clearly not our world, that is very clearly not a real world. And then it tells a story. And if you think about it, that should be okay. It's again, I don't necessarily want to pass judgment on fantasy, ultra-detailed fantasy or world building or anything. But I maybe do want to pass a little judgment on the attitude we tend to have sometimes as modern readers, where we expect that and we view it as a quality of a good story. Well, it's a certain style of storytelling, but it's not the only style of storytelling, and we're reading fiction books, right? Obviously they're not real, and so sometimes being invited into a more whimsical world that isn't quite as detailed, that maybe leaves things a little bit blurry along the edges, maybe that's worthwhile. Maybe there's a way of telling, maybe there's stories that can be told in that format that can't be told elsewhere, in the more detailed, ultra-realistic format. Probably the best modern example of this style, I think, is in Neil Gaiman's stuff, and that's probably no accident. As I was reading a little bit about this book, I learned that he apparently has it listed in his top 10 novels of all time. And as I was thinking about that, as I reflected on the book, it very much shows, because you look at something like American Gods, where we're given this world, and yes, there's certain rules to it, but we're not given an ultra-elaborate backstory and everything. And if you think about it, it's not a world in that novel that could actually exist, right? And what I mean by that is, like, you think about, like, George R. R. Martin's Westeros. You might be able to find things that just don't make sense there, but it's so detailed that when you're reading it, it feels as though this could be a real world. And something like American Gods is simply not like that. And intentionally so. If you think about what's going on in that novel, where all the different things we believe in become gods that have some ability to influence the world around us, that's a world that falls apart very quickly if we try and think about what it would be like to actually live in it. Same thing with something like Neverwhere. Same thing with Ocean at the End of the Lane. So it's a very common quality in his work, I think, to write stories with detail, with thought into them, but are more fairy tale-esque in the worlds they present. They're not trying to present this ultra-realistic world. And I think it's a shame we don't have more of that. I really do. Because it's not laziness. It really isn't laziness. It's an intentional stylistic choice to maybe push us past our rational mind that wants every little detail to be in its proper place, and simply enter the world of the story, accept it on its own terms, realize that it's not a real place, and then just go with what the author is trying to say to us in the form of the story. And I think there's something very valuable in that maybe we're missing by the fact that 99% of fantasy novels simply don't fit that mold. I think even Tolkien, I mentioned the whole fantasy or magic system thing that has developed in more modern fantasy novels. That's not the case with him. There's a sense of mystery there. There's a sense of we don't know precisely what Gandalf's powers are, or the power of the elves, or how they all work and everything. And so you get a little bit of that in Tolkien. I think we've, Tolkien obviously very detailed with his histories, his languages and everything. It was profound and incredible. But we've kind of taken that mold and pushed it to its extreme in a way that I think isn't always healthy. But anyway, so stylistically, I really like this book, and I think that there is a lot to recommend here. And I think it would be great if books like this became more influential with modern authors. Now, story-wise, this is a very good book as well. What we're presented with is a world, kind of a country, I think it's called Dormer, with its capital city is called Lud-In-The-Mist, hence the novel's title. And the country of Dormer borders this fairyland. And the people in Dormer have decided long ago that they are going to live as though fairyland does not exist. So legally, within the laws of the country and with the laws of Lud and everything, fairyland does not exist. There's no recognition of it. People are to have no contact with it. Anything, the fairy fruit, which becomes like a big deal in the novel, is banned, and nobody's to eat it. It's not allowed in the country and everything. And so there's this sense where what the people are trying to accomplish is live as though this entire country that borders them is not there. And of course, you don't need me to tell you how something like this goes in the novel. That system falls apart, and that's where our dramatic tension in the novel comes from. And I think that part of what is very interesting about this novel, I'm not going to go into details because I think that there's a real pleasure in letting this unfold before you, but we're essentially presented with two ways of dealing with that type of experience. Of what happens when the world that we have constructed is invaded by an inconvenient reality. And we're given one way that is filled with death and conspiracy and evil, an attempt to reconcile those and bring in reality, and another that is more focused on love and on truth, and on building something valuable. And I found this thing very profound, because if you think about it, both these sides have noble goals. I mean, the goal in both cases is noble and worthwhile. And there was times where I kind of wondered, well, you know, is the person who's ostensibly the villain of this novel going to turn out to be the hero? Because his goal seems to be the correct one, which is to undo this complete lie that the people in this world are living with, that they've constructed of themselves. And that is a noble goal. He sees the problem. He sees that they've constructed a false reality for themselves, and he wants to undo it. And then the way he goes about undoing it is completely wrong. And that's a very powerful theme. There's a lot to chew on in this novel. There's a lot to think about thematically. Because it's, I don't know if I'd say it's morally ambiguous. Because we are presented with good guys and bad guys in this novel. You know, it's not like a George R. R. Martin thing where everybody's not quite good and not quite completely bad. You know, it's not like that. But we're presented with a morally complex situation. And even though we recognize that our villains are villains, we understand what pushed them to that point. And that's very powerful writing, and I think that's something difficult to do. You know, in some ways, I think it's a lot easier to go one of two ways when you're writing a novel with a moral center. You know, you go to the extreme of all the good guys are good, and all the bad guys are bad, and there's no ambiguity in anything they do, and there's no complexity in any of their choices or their actions. Or you go to the other extreme where everything's ambiguous, and nothing's quite good, and nothing's quite bad, and blah, 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 blah. And I think both of those are fundamentally flawed. Neither of them, and I'm speaking here from a Catholic Christian perspective, but neither of them is an accurate picture of morality in this world, where morality is, I believe, a very real thing, but it's also a very complex thing. You know, and to ask anybody who's ever spent any time studying moral theology, you know, things on the surface appear to be very black and white, quickly become complex. Or gray as you dive into them. But that doesn't eliminate the fact that there is such a thing as right and wrong. You know, good and evil. There are things that are good and there are things that are evil. It's just that life is complex. And I think that a novel like this really gets to the heart of that. In a way similar to Tolkien. You know, you think about a character like Boromir. Tolkien gets flack for... He's sometimes accused of being on that one extreme of everybody's good, or bad, and there's no complexity. And that's nonsense. I mean, you think about a character like Boromir, or a character like Saruman. I mean, we understand why Saruman does what he does, and we know it's wrong, but we get it. Same thing with Boromir. We know it's wrong, but we see the moral complexity. We see the struggle that he's in that leads him to that choice. And the same thing comes out in this novel. And I think that, just like with the stylistic thing, we need more novels like that. We need more stories like this that are able to present us with a situation of moral complexity. And then with still having a moral center, and then pit those two things against each other. And for authors who can do that, that's a very powerful way of writing. It's a very powerful way of drawing out dramatic and thematic tension in your work, and Hope Mireless does that very well. So, in conclusion, I thought this was a great novel. I'm going to give it 5 stars. It's going to be different. If you read it, it's going to be very different than what you're used to with fantasy. That's good. Go with it. Accept it. Realize it might be a struggle at points as you realize this isn't quite how a fantasy novel is supposed to feel. That's true, at least from our perspective, and that's okay. And so go with it, turn on your brain, be ready to think about some morally complex situations, and enjoy the fact that this is a masterpiece of a novel that has been forgotten, and enjoy that you are somebody who's found it and has the opportunity to read it, and hopefully enjoy it just as much as I did. So 5 stars for Lud-In-The-Mist. Great novel that deserves far more modern attention than it seems to get. So that's all for now. I'm Ben DiBono, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews. Goodbye.